Hey everyone! Just a forewarning, there's a lot of construction noise going on and it's super annoying, but there's nothing I can do about it, so just gonna have to ignore it. This video is an addendum to a video I made over a year ago outlining why it is morally consistent to be both vegan and pro-choice. If you haven't seen it, I'll link it below because I won't be reiterating every single point that I made. I was inspired to make this video by a post I saw on Facebook comparing arguments made in favor of veganism with arguments against abortion, and arguments against veganism with pro-choice arguments. You can pause to read if you feel inclined. Before I respond point by point, I wanted to address a few comments left on my original video. One commenter said, "I find it difficult to understand how vegans convince themselves in siding with pro-choice. I always ask, what if you were aborted? What if your own present existence could have been impacted by someone's choice of termination? We all developed from the beginning stages that are deemed by pro-choicers as non-conscious. How does this not convict people? How can a life that was allowed to be developed to its fullest justify taking the life of an unborn fetus? I truly grapple with this." To her question, what if you were aborted? The answer is pretty simple. I couldn't care less if I had been aborted because I wouldn't exist to care. These what if questions are no different than what if my parents had decided not to have sex in that exact moment? My present existence was ultimately the decision that my parents made to have sex exactly when they did. Since they were trying for a child, had they tried another night, a different sperm would have met the egg, and an entirely different person would exist today, instead of me. That other human doesn't suffer in the slightest because they were never conceived. The choice to not have a child is the choice to not have a child, whether you successfully avoid pregnancy or get an abortion. Had my mom made this choice either way, I wouldn't exist, and I wouldn't suffer in the slightest from my lack of existence. Another commenter made a very good point that if we were to grant the unborn fetus the right to life, we would be granting it special rights that aren't given to full-grown adults. The right to use another person's organs without their consent to sustain itself. How is forcing a woman to carry a pregnancy to term, risking complications and potentially death, just? But forcing someone to give up their kidney to save a life is unjust. Should the government force people to have their blood drawn against their will to save lives? That's not even an invasive surgery, let alone a 9-month-long, incredibly taxing endeavor. We have rights to bodily autonomy, but we don't have rights to infringe on someone else's bodily autonomy. Alright, let's get into it. Point number 1 is flawed because sentience is what matters. As I mentioned in my original video, I have no qualms with abortion prior to 24 weeks because the fetus has yet to develop sentience. The current scientific consensus for fetal sentience is between 24 to 27 weeks, so I'm lowballing here. I said 20 weeks in my original video, but that's an extreme lowball. The hypothesis that human fetuses are capable of perceiving pain in the first trimester is not supported by science. The consensus is that a fetus is not capable of feeling pain until the 3rd trimester, which begins at about 27 weeks of pregnancy. Electroencephalography, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, indicates that the capacity for functional pain perception in premature infants does not exist before 29 or 30 weeks. And several lines of evidence suggest that a fetus does not awaken during its time in the womb. Much of the literature on fetal pain simply extrapolates from findings and research on premature babies. The presence of such chemicals as, you can read these here, in both human and animal fetuses indicate that the fetus is both sedated and anesthetized when in the womb. These chemicals are oxidized with the newborn's first few breaths and washed out of the tissues, allowing consciousness to occur. If the fetus is asleep throughout gestation, then the possibility of fetal pain is greatly minimized. In other words, it might be the case that even 3rd trimester fetuses do not feel pain, and it is highly unlikely that 2nd trimester fetuses feel pain at all. Side note, to kill someone while they're asleep or comatose is to take the life of a sentient being with an interest in continuing their existence. A fetus has yet to develop sentience or interests. For this reason, killing a person in a coma is disanalogous to getting an abortion. The second point demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of what bodily autonomy is. As I mentioned, the right to life does not include the right to use another person's body for sustenance. We violate non-human animals' bodily autonomy by forcibly impregnating them, performing inhumane experiments on them, etc. We violate a woman's bodily autonomy by taking away their reproductive rights and forcing them to give birth against their will. What stands out to me in this section is the mention of the stress of being artificially inseminated and having to give birth. A fetus prior to 27 weeks does not feel stress. Also, notice the irony of acknowledging the stress of being forced to give birth in an article in favor of forced birth. The next point is fair enough, but I take issue with anti-abortion advocates showing gruesome images of late-term abortions without providing context. The vast majority of abortions occur prior to 13 weeks, and less than 2% after 21 weeks. Most late-term abortions were either medically necessary or delayed due to the inaccessibility of abortion providers in certain areas. Restrictions that anti-abortion advocates push for actually increase the number of late-term abortions. Also, anti-abortion organizations have been known to deceive people with images like this one. Of course, the same could be said about vegan organizations at times, but there's no sense in exaggerating by routinely highlighting the worst incidents of abuse on factory farms, because the standard industry practices are bad enough. If you're gonna share gruesome images of late-term abortions or animal abuse, give context and share the whole truth. Without proper context, it's emotional manipulation. This next point is just yikes. I've made my stance on this clear in my video Dismantling Human Supremacy, but comparing abortion to slavery and the Holocaust is grossly inaccurate. Embryos and fetuses are not sentient beings, therefore they are not victims of oppression. Is abortion unnecessary? It depends on how you define necessary. In the case of most abortions, whether or not it's necessary has no relevance, because again, the fetus is not sentient. Necessity is only relevant in the case of late-term abortions. She argues that abortions are cruel because there's so many alternatives. This is a common argument anti-abortion advocates make. They're not anti-choice. Adoption is an option. Women have the choice to opt out of raising the child if they don't have the financial resources or desire to be a parent. But this framing still takes away the woman's bodily autonomy. Not wanting to be pregnant is reason enough. Just as not wanting to donate blood because it makes you queasy is reason enough for the government not to compel you to do so. I respect the argument that progressive Christians make that the financial burden of having a child is not a good argument for abortion, but an argument for welfare programs. But can we talk about how morally backwards it is to suggest that one should consider abandoning their infant at a fire station before they consider having an abortion? This next point doesn't make any sense. First of all, the right to continue living as an autonomous, sentient being is not the same as the right to be born. And to her second point, I'm not sure how these are connected. Animals are here with us, not for us. Yes, they're not objects or commodities, correct. But this is not analogous to abortion because aborted fetuses are not sentient beings being exploited for profit. Okay, now we move on to the supposed parallels between non-veganism and pro-choicism. Anti-abortion advocates reject the term pro-choice because they see it as a euphemism, and I can understand why. As a vegan, I reject the notion that eating meat is a personal choice because it involves a victim. In their eyes, an aborted fetus is a victim of murder, and we shouldn't have the freedom to commit murder. But to be a victim requires the capacity to suffer. For this reason, abortion is a personal choice. This is a bit of a tangent, but it's interesting how both sides of this debate reject the terms and labels used to describe each position. Pro-choice advocates reject the term pro-abortion, and rightfully so, because most of us would love to see abortion rates go down. It's not like abortions come with zero risk or harm. Pro-choice advocates also reject the term pro-life because of the hypocrisy of the majority of people who take this stance, and the implication that to be pro-choice is to be anti-life or pro-death. I reject the term pro-life because the life and well-being of a full-grown adult supersedes the life of a fetus, which has yet to develop the capacity for well-being. Pro-life is a euphemism for pro-forced birth. It looks like I skipped over this point when I was writing the script, but again, this demonstrates a misunderstanding of what bodily autonomy means and what it means to be a victim. On to the next point. All concede that this is not a strong argument in favor of reproductive rights because it's a red herring. It fails to address the root of the issue. We're no longer talking about sentience or bodily autonomy. If someone believes that a fetus is a victim of murder, saying that the world is overpopulated is not persuasive. Overpopulation is not a justification to kill a human or a deer. So if one believes a fetus deserves the right to life, then it's not a justification for abortion. This point perfectly illustrates the author's confusion. She is equating characteristics such as intelligence and physical size with sentience. She's right that intelligence and size have no moral relevance, but sentience has the utmost relevance. When carnists claim that fish don't feel pain, they're wrong. When pro-choice advocates claim that embryos and early-term fetuses don't feel pain, they're correct. A key difference. It's true that ableism is a form of discrimination like speciesism, but I don't think abortion is inherently ableist, because disabled people are sentient beings with interests. In other words, they're victims of discrimination. I know I've said this 1,000 times, but to be a victim requires the capacity to suffer. I will say, though, I recognize the ethical conundrum of deciding to get an abortion upon the discovery that the fetus has a disability. It depends on the severity of the disability and how greatly it will reduce their quality of life. Not much to say about this next point, other than I agree. To appeal to nature or to tradition is a logical fallacy. But then she throws in the bit about God aborting babies, and I have to say, considering about 20% of pregnancies end in miscarriage, if you believe in God, you have to ask yourself, what the fuck, dude? I've heard this more as an argument against the benevolence of God rather than for abortion, but maybe this is an argument pro-choice Christians make. I don't know. The next point is fair. Legality does not determine morality. Okay, moving on. This point is a false analogy. The animals we exploit on free-range organic farms are sentient beings with interests. To make exceptions for cage-free eggs or grass-fed beef is to defend animal exploitation. To defend abortion before a certain number of weeks is generally based on factors such as sentience and viability, which are highly relevant to discussions of morality. But I will say, some of these exceptions are based on emotion rather than logic. It shouldn't matter if a woman was raped. If a fetus is truly considered a victim, rape does not justify abortion. If a fetus is not considered a victim, a woman should not have had to experience trauma to justify getting an abortion. Lastly, it's true that carnists tend to focus on our differences rather than our similarities, but the difference between humans and non-human animals is morally insignificant, whereas the difference between humans and human embryos and fetuses is morally significant. The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Non-human animals can suffer. The unborn cannot. Sentience is paramount. We made it to the end of the list, but before I go, I wanted to address a few more points raised by anti-abortion advocates. To start, Pro-forced birth advocates often cite statistics of how unsafe abortions are, but ignore the fact that childbirth carries higher risks. They use pseudo-logic in response to the my body, my choice argument, claiming that pro-choice advocates are disregarding the bodily autonomy of the unborn. Again, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what bodily autonomy is. Listen to Christian author Trent Horn's knockdown argument against the pro-choice position regarding bodily autonomy.
And the uterus, what is it for? My kidneys are for sustaining my own body, but the uterus would be for the child it's designed for, so the child has a natural right to reside there.
This is all an appeal to nature. Yes, obviously that is the biological function of the uterus, and pregnancy is the biological consequence of sexual intercourse. But human rights, including reproductive rights, are based on secular moral reasoning, not what is natural. How does one reach the conclusion, using logic, not invoking God's will, that a fetus has the right to reside in a woman's uterus, whether she likes it or not? The majority of staunch anti-abortion advocates are religious, yet they attempt to make secular arguments because they want everyone to adopt this position, and they know that invoking God's will is not persuasive to most people. I know that there are some atheists out there who oppose abortion, but I have yet to hear a compelling secular argument for making abortion illegal.
Think about it. We would find it horrifying if a pregnant woman intentionally took drugs while knowing that it could cause her child to be harmed physically or mentally. However, if a woman has the right to do anything she wants with her body, including terminating her child, then we can't say that's wrong.
Smoking and drinking while pregnant is wrong because you're stunting the child's development and causing lasting physical and mental harm. Bodily autonomy grants you the right to smoke cigarettes, but it doesn't grant you the right to endanger your children with secondhand smoke. If you intend to carry the baby to term, smoking while pregnant is child abuse because of the repercussions later on. Terminating a pregnancy prior to 27 weeks doesn't cause physical or mental harm to the fetus. And there are no repercussions for the child later on because, again, suffering does not visit the non-existent. I follow the reasoning that if harming someone is wrong, killing them would be the ultimate harm. I use this argument when I make the case for veganism. If we wince at the sight of a factory farm employee kicking or punching a cow, how can we say that bolt gunning them in the head is humane or justified? Regardless if the killing is quick and painless, you're still taking a sentient life. But in the case of abortion prior to the 3rd trimester, you aren't ending a conscious being's life. You're terminating an unconscious life form's potential.
My body, my choice. That's one of the most common sort of on-the-street defenses for abortion. And the rationale goes like this. A woman has a right to do whatever she wants with her own body. And so since the unborn is allegedly merely part of the woman's body, therefore she's allowed to have an abortion. But here's the key question. If the unborn is merely part of the mother's body, then what part of the woman is missing after an abortion? Well, the answer is obvious. Nothing. All the parts of the woman are still present after an abortion, and that's because the unborn is not part of her body, but rather a separate body that lies within her.
Now, this question of whether the unborn is merely a part of the mother's body is actually a scientific question. And if you look at the science of embryology on this question, it is decisive in answering this question. And it turns out there are a number of different qualities and characteristics that are different about the unborn than they are about the mother. So, for example, gender. The unborn's gender can be different than that of the mother. And so, for example, if the unborn is a boy, then the unborn has male genitals. Now, clearly the mother does not have male genitals as a part of her body, and so that's why we conclude that the unborn is different than the mother's body.
This is a straw man. Obviously, a fetus is not literally part of a woman's body, but it relies on a woman's body, and thus it is her decision to carry it to term or not. Another pro-forced birth argument that falls flat is, a baby relies on its mother for years outside of the womb. What difference does it make? Well, a baby relies on a caretaker, but not their biological mother's literal body. A baby doesn't rely on a non-consenting woman's organs like a non-viable fetus does.
Okay, it's a murder of a human being when you're talking about these babies and this idea that you get to choose that. Look, you got to choose a lot of things in life. You don't get to choose another human being's death. That's not something you get to choose.
You don't get to choose to use another person's body without their consent, Ben. Why grant special rights to a fetus? And I know what his response would be. You chose to have sex knowing the risk, so you have to deal with the consequences. But consenting to sex is not consenting to pregnancy and childbirth. Sometimes birth control methods fail. And regardless, forced birth should not be a legally mandated consequence of having unprotected sex, considering a fetus is not sentient.
So, when is it okay to kill this? When is it okay to kill this? Is it okay to kill this thing at week 14? When the heart is pumping several quarts of blood through the body every day? How about week 15 when the baby has an adult's taste buds? How about month 4 when the bone marrow is beginning to form? How about that? Or how about weeks 9 and 10 when the baby's teeth are already beginning to form? Its fingernails are already beginning to develop. We're talking about 2 months old, right? The baby can turn the head and frown. The baby can hiccup. Is that okay to kill? I think what's important here is the science. And I think you're talking about the creation of a unique human life on day 1, and you can see it, and you can see the growth, and if you're willing to point out to me where it is that this becomes a human as opposed to a ball of tissue, then let's hear it.
Here, Ben is committing what's known as the continuum fallacy, also known as the Sorites paradox. Basically, to make the leap from the fact that there exists a moral gray area because there is a continuum on which it is impossible to draw a distinct line, that there is therefore no relevant distinction between the opposite ends of the spectrum, is fallacious. This paradox is commonly illustrated with a beard. Clearly, one single chin hair does not constitute a beard. If you saw a teenage boy with a couple of patches of facial hair, you wouldn't describe him as having a beard. At what exact point does facial hair become a beard? It's impossible to say. But that doesn't mean there isn't a clear distinction between a teenage boy with peach fuzz and a man with a full-grown beard. In the same sense, it's hard to gauge exactly when a fetus becomes a baby. But it's pretty clear, to most reasonable people at least, that an embryo is not a baby. Some pro-life arguments are logically valid, meaning the conclusion follows from the premises, but not sound, meaning the premises are not true. Pro-life advocates can be quite intelligent and able to point out logical fallacies in pro-choice arguments. For example, the burning building scenario that goes something like, a fertility clinic is on fire. You're in a room with a baby and a case of fertilized embryos. You can only grab one. This scenario is used to show that pro-lifers do see a difference between actual and potential life. However, on its own, this is a bad argument. No different than when a carnist presents the hypothetical scenario of a child and a dog drowning in a lake. Which one do you save? Just because we value one more than the other doesn't mean the other doesn't have value. But when you peel back the layers of anti-abortion arguments, you'll see a religious or emotional attachment to the sanctity of human life. The belief that human life is so sacred, so special, that moral value begins at the moment of conception stems from an irrational framework. It's particularly irrational when one prioritizes anti-abortion legislation above all else. Voting based on this single issue when the political party associated with the pro-life movement fights to defund social programs which help reduce the need for abortion is prioritizing potential life over actual life. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up or a thumbs down, leave a comment, and check out my original video in the description. Alright, peace out.
Yo, how when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me nah eat no fish, nah no meat now. How when me eat them, I wonder when me yam. When me tell them say that I'm a vegan man. How when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them